Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This last week, the provincial premiers had a virtual meeting, and surprising nobody, they asked the federal government for a lot more money. In this case, it was $28 billion a year additionally for healthcare. But the government is not willing to play ball just yet, and I figured we'd talk a little bit about why the federal government should have reservations about this kind of a demand. This is not just strictly a jurisdictional issue because the federal government and the provincial governments have long since negotiated agreements around healthcare spending, and the federal government contributes a certain amount and largely ensures that there's equitable access across the country so that no matter where you live in Canada, you should access the same level of healthcare no matter where you are. And no matter where you go in the country, you will have access to it through various agreements, so that if you are a resident of one province and you're visiting another one and you wind up in a hospital, you can still get treatment because all the systems are run provincially and so on and so on. So that's largely how the system is structured federally versus provincially. And so what premiers have been asking for is obviously more money for their healthcare systems. And they like to trot out a lot of different excuses in terms of rising costs, aging populations, so on and so on. None of this is necessarily new. But one of the things that they like to also say is that it used to be the federal government would contribute on a 50% basis, so it'd be a 50-50 cost share. But then they neglect to mention that at one point, the provinces and the federal government struck a new agreement. So instead of funding healthcare 50-50, the federal government turned over a bunch of tax points to the provinces, which allowed them to raise more revenue on a much more flexible basis. And that was the agreement, and that's what happened, and the provinces were all happy with that. And now a lot of premiers are engaging in a little bit of revisionist history to try and make it sound like the federal government has become far less generous when that was not the agreement at all. And this is one of the things we need to basically pay attention to, is because yes, there is history behind why that funding formula changed and so on. The other thing to remember is that the premiers are also asking for this 28 billion a year be unconditional, so that the federal government won't attach any strings to it to ensure that it's going for certain healthcare outcomes. They did when the Liberals were first elected in 2015, come to an agreement with provinces around certain pots of money for things like home care and mental health. The provinces obviously don't want that kind of similar agreement going forward. I'm not sure the federal government is necessarily going to play ball because they also have things they want in terms of national standards for long-term care, which obviously a big thing in the wake of this pandemic. Basically saying we will give provinces more money for long-term care, but you need to agree to these particular standards. Provinces, of course, don't want to have to agree to any standards, so they're pushing back on that. Also, the National Pharmacare program that the federal government is moving towards implementing, obviously they want provincial buy-in on that. So again, there's another point where they can say, we will give you more money, but you must agree to implementing National Pharmacare within your provincial jurisdictions. Again, these are negotiations that are ongoing, but these are also considerations that we need to keep in mind when provinces come asking for money unconditionally. The other reason why we need to be very careful when provinces ask for unconditional money is because it doesn't always get spent on the things they say they want to spend it on. With the previous healthcare escalator negotiated by the Paul Martin government, which was 6% a year, what the math showed was that even though the healthcare transfers were going up 6% a year, the healthcare spending was not. It was generally less than 3% a year that it was increasing. So that means that all that money that the federal government was transferring to provinces was going to other things. And the provinces say, oh, no, that's not it at all, but the math is the math, and we could all see it. So when Stephen Harper, at the end of that agreement, changed it so that it was rising with GDP or 3%, whichever was higher, that again is a reflection of what this spending was within the provinces, and so the escalator matched a little more closely with what the actual healthcare increases were. Provinces, people like to say that was a cut. It was not actually a cut because the money is still increasing. It's just increasing at a different rate. But again, it's because the money that was supposed to be going to healthcare was not going to healthcare under that particular system. So again, when provinces want money for this, we need to we as Canadian taxpayers want to make sure it's going to what they say it's going to go to. Other reasons why they should have reservations around this are provinces oftentimes like to ask for more money for something, and then once the federal government starts paying for it, reduce their own spending in that area. We saw this with infrastructure again when this Liberal government came into power, and they ramped up infrastructure spending within the provinces, and all of a sudden the provinces started slowing down their own infrastructure funding. So what was intended to be a mass infrastructure program that would help boost productivity in this country didn't end up getting any of those gains because the provincial spending ramped down as the federal spending ramped up, and this is something that the federal government would rather not happen again. So, that they take on a bigger share of the funding formula when the provinces are looking for an excuse to fund it less. That wouldn't lead to the outcomes that anyone's looking for. So again, they're going to want assurances around that. And we've also seen places similarly where when federal transfers increased, premiers turned that into tax cuts in their own jurisdiction. And again, that just kind of ends up burning the federal government because it wasn't intended for, those transfers weren't intended so that the premiers could cut their taxes in their provinces. It was to increase the spending for better outcomes for those programs. So these are things that the federal government has real concerns around when it comes to demands for unconditional spending increases. And it's with this in mind that the federal government is not saying yes to any of those right now. Part of it is just they want a better picture of what our fiscal house looks like post-pandemic. But I think it's also because they've got, pharmacare and long-term care and so on. And they want strings attached to those funds and to have a better sense of what the healthcare system is going to look like post-pandemic. And I think it's not unwise for them to kind of take a longer term view of this rather than just acceding to these demands that the premiers are making based on short-term calculation. And that's basically the situation we're in, and why a federal government isn't just going to say yes and turn over a blank check. And that is everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.